Good afternoon, and thank you for this opportunity, Dr. Ben, to share about the mapping of social solidarity economy in the Malaysian context and drawing some relevance to the ASEAN because we are in an ASEAN discussion. So the Malaysian experiences can highlight some of the issues. Can I request my PowerPoint to be uploaded? Thank you. Thank you, Chandra. So this is the theme, and if we can move on. Now, the outline for my presentation is very simple. I would very briefly mention about the methodology, then move on to the development policy environment in Malaysia, something about legislative framework, and the SSE types that I have identified in the mapping, some lessons learned, and finally some implications for ASEAN. The methodology is simple and straightforward. It's part of a bigger study, but I have drawn out only key points with reference to mapping social solidarity economy type organizations using SX 5 dimensions, which Dr. Ben Cunyones developed. So the mapping captures the organizations, and we would recognize their closeness to SSE objectives in Malaysia. So 3 types of organizations were identified. Firstly, cooperatives, and this is a large avenue, and all over ASEAN, there are cooperatives, but not all the cooperatives share the SSE dimension. Second is social enterprises, a more recent development, not only in ASEAN, Asia, and around the world. And thirdly, about non-profit societies, dominantly grant-driven societies and foundations, which are now shifting to adopt community-based economic projects at the ground level. Next. Now, the policy environment in Malaysia, which is development policies, are an important backdrop to discussing SSE. Is there public policy or legislation that enables social solidarity economy or social economy to flourish? Now, Malaysia has a strong 5-year development plans, and in these plans, the emphasis is about economic growth and distribution, enhancing inclusiveness, emphasis on equitable society, and more recently in the 11th Malaysia Plan, the emphasis is towards multi-dimensional poverty, not just income, but economic, social, health, employment, and so forth. And in the most past plan, the 11th plan, there is a policy thrust towards developing community and social-based enterprises. So this is an important theme that comes up, that it's not just private sector, for-profit type of companies, but the development of community and social-based enterprises that the policy framework provides. And we believe in the next plan, which is the 12th, there will be greater emphasis. But one eye-opener to the SSE in Malaysia is actually a policy that was released last year called the National Entrepreneurship Policy that was released by the government. And it has a social enterprise trust. And the social enterprise trust is that businesses have a social and environmental impact. It's about entrepreneurship through community building. It's an emphasis on inclusive and sustainable businesses. So it's not just for profit's sake, but inclusiveness, sustainability, and the trust for community well-being. And they also highlighted in the entrepreneurship policy that they would use cooperatives and social enterprises. So this is sort of a first important thrust that reveals that the Malaysian government policy is shifting, or at least giving the space and room for cooperatives and social enterprises. Next. Now, the legislative framework has a number of legal frameworks that enable. So one is for-profit companies, and for-profit companies do carry out CSR activities that impact social and environment. And it is the Companies Act that provides that. And social enterprises are largely registered under the Companies Act. Now, the cooperatives, like in other ASEAN countries, there is the Cooperatives Act, and in Malaysia, there are a large number of cooperatives with over 14,000 over cooperatives with 6 million members, but not all of them have a strong SSE dimension. Many of them are maybe even focus on middle class or upper middle class, higher income bracket groups, but there is a sizable number that have clear features towards SSE. Now, I also added on 2 other legal frameworks, which is the Societies Act, which is the largest number of organizations, which are over 77,000 organizations, but membership is only about 2 million. That undertakes a social and development, largely grant-driven. And there are also non-profit companies under the Companies Act, which are limited by guarantee of foundations. And these two carry out community projects, economic and enterprise projects. So legislative framework, the policy framework has enabling indicators in the Malaysian context. Next. So the first type of SSE organizations are actually cooperatives under the Cooperative Act. It has a cooperative commission. There is a cooperative policy. It has 68 different types of target groups and areas. And a British Council study indicates that over 78% of these organizations have a social enterprise element. Now, the cooperatives, like other SSE, have some features that are quite common that emerges from the case studies and in the mapping. So in the mapping, I'm highlighting a number of such organizations. They're economically viability. There is a social responsibility, which could have a social and environmental impact. Third, there is a collective decision-making, which is different from private sector, which is business-driven, could be individual or family. Here, collective could mean a community or a group of people that could be a specific target, like single mothers or women or indigenous people. There is an element of accountability, and it does share cooperative values and concepts, which has a strong solidarity emphasis. So SSE type are cooperatives, not all cooperatives, but cooperatives that have a collective economic viability projects that has social impact as well. Next. Now, the cooperative society, we had some conversation with the minister and the senior government officials. It calls for visionary leadership at the cooperative level, managerial competencies. It's understanding the cooperative concepts and not just using cooperatives as a vehicle to undertake business. It has a strong trust building element. Next. Concerning the cooperatives, let us look at a number of examples. The first is the Federal Land Development Authority, which provided land to over 112,000 families, which is an old land settlement scheme, and that is by a statutory body. But Felder moved on from agriculture and economy to also provide a cohesive community that addresses education, housing, community cohesion, and so forth. The settlers, over 260,000 of them, formed 212 cooperatives where they pool their savings in order to reinvest. So that becomes a very significant solidarity, community-based economy that has generated returns for the landless people who then became landowners through this government assistance and became an SSE organization through the cooperative movement. Next. Example 2 is actually a microcredit institution, which is Amanah Ikhtiar Malaysia, which is a Grameen bank. It provides micro loans that is by registered trust body that is run by trustees. But what is significant is the trust established self-help group approach because it's a group guarantee. And so there are over 380,000 women in every district in Malaysia. Now, while they are all micro loan borrowers and they repay the loans, the members of Amanah Ikhtiar, or the borrowers, and they are called friends, and the Malay word is sahabat, they formed a cooperative, a single cooperative that has over 350,000 members. And what they have done is, whenever they meet, the women are to save some money. That money, which amounted to over 17 million, was then pooled together as cooperative investment, and now it's grown over 500 million. So the pooling of their savings and making bigger impact and creating collective market niche for their products is another good example of cooperatives, and this is largely 99% are women who run this. Next example. The third example is actually from a faith-based institution, which is an alternative pawn shop, which is an Islamic pawn broking service. The pawn shop is a traditional bank for the poor, where the poor put some collateral like jewelry, gold, a watch, and things like that. So you have the traditional private business run, but under the cooperatives could use Islamic principles by which there is no interest, but there is a fee collected for the keeping the jewelry, and on the return to return back the principal sum. So access to interest-free credit or at low cost short-term cash advances with collateral. And the Arano, as it's called, comes from an Islamic alternative community base. So under the Cooperatives Act, it is possible to set up these Islamic pawn broking services, which are a great assistance. So many of the cooperatives like the Felder, the Amanah Ikhtiar Sahabats group, and the Cooperative Bank has set this up, as a facility. Next. Now, the second type of SSE organizations are called social enterprises. Social enterprise is a new development in Malaysia, and there is a blueprint called the Malaysian Social Enterprise Blueprint. It's a major breakthrough because it creates a recognition for businesses or community-based approaches that have a positive social and environmental impact, which is financially sustainable as a business. It's not dependent on grants. Next. So the social enterprise is established under MAGIC, an agency of the government. The blueprint, it provides a clear description for the first time in a government document between traditional for-profit, non-profit, and then social enterprises. Social enterprises are defined. It sees a dual impact, not just wealth creation, but the impact on society or the environment. There is the matching grant up to 10 million, which means each individual enterprise could apply for funding if they can raise the capital. So if you can raise 100,000 ringgit or 200,000 ringgit, then the government would top that up as a grant that is provided to these businesses. So there is a social mission, there is a business a model, and the target is the bottom 40 or poor and low income. So they didn't change the legislation, but they introduced an accreditation process, which is interesting because accreditation process is through an agency, government recognition across all the government agencies. So businesses that are self-declared and registered, there are over 320, and then the accredited ones are 29, and the social enterprise A+ with full accreditation at the current stage is 8 organizations, because they require 2 years. You have to show your returns, you have to show your impact assessment, and then you are certified, which is a good status for access for further credit, access to tax exemption, and so forth. Next. One example of a social enterprise, because we have over 320 registered social enterprises at the first level, Masala Wheels has reached level 3 accreditation at the A level. Masala on Wheels started as a mobile food provider, but now it has a restaurant, it has a kitchen, it has a training center, and it's focused with high risk, at-risk young people who might be underprivileged, who might have dropped out, who might have other behavioral problems, but they've brought them into training with a professional cook, and they do food preparation. And especially during the COVID period, they prepared and delivered over 16,000 food packages. They introduced an app system through which they did crowdfunding, they did food without borders. So it is an enterprise that has a social objective, and it's making a contribution. So like this, there are over 300 enterprises that are linked to this accreditation process. Next. The third type of SSE organizations identified are largely non-profit societies and foundations, either under the Societies Act or under the Companies Act. Under the Societies Act, normally they were grant-driven or donation-based organizations that have now begun to incorporate or facilitate or provide capacity building, or have initiated social enterprises and community-based businesses. Likewise, under the Companies Act, CSRs or foundations set up by companies or well-wishers have also shifted from handout welfare relief approaches to more social-based and community-based examples, initiatives. Now, two good examples that would be illustrated later on during this week are in the SSE case studies. Two organizations. One is OA Organic, which is an enterprise, but it was founded and established and supported by a foundation. It's an organic farm that's also working with the private sector marketing and sales supermarket. And it's among indigenous people who are using their traditional lands. It's in West Malaysia. But an East Malaysian example is the Best Society, which is an ecotourism initiative in Sabah among the indigenous people. And here too, they are working with a private tour Borneo company that's a very large tour and travel company that's facilitating this. But this is under the Societies Act. But they have moved towards ecotourism as a form of income and wealth generation and empowerment. Now, what are the lessons learned so far from this case study or the mapping in Malaysia? Study shows that while there is no direct policy or legislation, however, SSE initiatives are emerging because there is an enabling environment. Likewise, secondly, the Cooperatives Act seems to provide the best environment and space for SSE development on the ground. It has the policy, it has the legislation, it has the banking and financial space as well to do it. The other is the SSE accreditation, which provides this contrast between for-profit, non-profit, but at the same time, it's a good example. And we have seen from a number of examples, good SSE models in Malaysia, which can be scaled up and for replication as well. We also note that the size of some of the cooperatives like the Felda or the Sahabat Amanah Ikhtiar Malaysia is illustrating when ordinary people or people who are low income pool their savings, they are able to mobilize savings and use that for the common good and to impact economic and social improvements. Next. We are also seeing that this mapping in Malaysia has some policy implications and examples that can help other ASEAN countries as we are discussing. So I've highlighted three implications directly. And the first is that poverty is a major concern in ASEAN, and especially in the dominant market-driven pro-business environment. SSE has a possibility, and so we can look at community-based economic activities being undertaken in the Malaysian context in other ASEAN countries like Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, Cambodia, which is showing Myanmar, showing great potential in that context, in the collective way. We also note that while we have not highlighted it very much in the Malaysian mapping, actually the SSE has a strong correlation to a right to development approach, because here it's giving value to the poor, recognizing their potential. The poor can organize themselves, they can mobilize their savings through self-help and self-reliance. they can empower themselves. And so a right to development approach is much better than just a welfare or a relief dole or cash transfer system towards wealth creation at the ground. Now, let me conclude with 4 possibilities for ASEAN. What can we learn from Malaysia or the other examples highlighted? Where can we go from this, and what relevance to the ASEAN People's Forum and to ASEAN as a whole? ASEAN needs to recognize the collective initiatives at the grassroots. So it's not just 1, 2, it's available in all the 10 countries. So the collective initiatives in creating wealth and at the same time impacting positively social and environmental agenda. This is not given as much importance as the big companies and private sector initiatives. Community-based collective initiatives need to be recognized by ASEAN Secretariat, ASEAN as a whole, and even the ASEAN People's Forum. Second, it's possible to undertake a mapping exercise across all the 10 ASEAN countries, like how we have now done for Malaysia, Philippines, Indonesia. We could use the same methodology and enlarge this and document it. That is secondly. Thirdly, I think it is important for us to set up in the ASEAN People's Forum or in the ASEAN Secretariat or in ASEAN member countries or in ASEAN civil society as a whole, a special task force on SSE to promote community-based solidarity economy projects in order to build capacity, in order to create the platform through policy, through legislation, and to learn from best practices. So a task force can enhance this. And all the examples we are citing here through ESSEC is a possibility. And finally, it is possible for ASEAN or ASEAN banks and commercial sector to set up specific financing mechanism for social investment. So this is basically what I'm highlighting from the Malaysian experience, the mapping of it, the lessons learned, and the impact for ASEAN. I hope this is useful, and during question time, we can clarify some of the issues and move and create a better ASEAN for all the people living in ASEAN countries. Thank you very much.